Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, and best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to learn how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brad Hairston with Blue Prism. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. Today, we turn our attention to the public sector, and I'm very pleased to have as my guest David Ware, a partner with McKinsey Company, who is based in Arlington, Virginia. I will be talking with David about McKinsey's recently published report titled Reimagining U.S. Federal Work for the Post-Pandemic World. David, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Brad.
So why don't you start with an introduction of yourself and also tell us a little bit about the work that McKinsey does in the federal sector.
Sure. I'm a partner in our Washington, D.C. office. Been with McKinsey about 9 years. And the majority of my work is in digital analytics and technology transformation, as well as cybersecurity. I spend about 80% of my time in the public sector doing work in federal agencies, both civilian and defense. And then I spend about 20% of my time doing cybersecurity work in the private sector in healthcare. And then, McKinsey overall in the federal sector, we solve similar problems to what we do in corporate America. It's, large organizationally changing issues. How do we deal with digital transformation? How do we drive automation into the organization? How do we really change the way that we operate? How do we restructure the organization? How do you create culture change? So it's big, sort of top of mind topics. And in the last year or so, obviously, a lot of our work has centered on COVID and not just sort of how do you respond in the short term and how can you accelerate delivery of some of the critical issues that you need to deliver to support the workforce or to get vaccines out or those kind of things. But also sort of how do you take the next step after that and reimagine what your workforce can be and how you can support that workforce in a post-pandemic world.
Well, the recent report was certainly very interesting, and I want to dive into that with you. Let me start with this question. So, David, what are some of the biggest issues at the federal level that were exposed during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it was a few things. First of all, there's a huge disparity across the federal government of what can and cannot happen in a remote setting. And, it's exposed, I think, a lot of resilience issues across, both civilian and sort of defense national security organizations, which has said, we didn't actually realize how much of our processes require somebody to be in the office. And what infrastructure we do and don't have in place to be able to support those things. And there were some organizations that I think were already, investing in telework technologies and in the right infrastructure and in the right sort of workforce policies to get that stuff done. And those organizations had relatively little impact in the scheme of things. And then there were a lot of folks who realized that they didn't have enough simple things like government furnished equipment to support their workforce. They don't have enough phones or laptops, or that they've got processes that are very dependent on being in the office. Even things like submitting timesheets, very simple transactional tasks that theoretically don't really pose a security risk or anything like that to an organization, but are just dependent in the way that they're built on somebody being on site. The other challenge that I think a lot of folks faced was if you are going to operate in either a remote or a mixed setting, as opposed to a totally on-site setting, how do managers and employees operate in that construct? Can you actually, make the pivot and change the way that the workforce is behaving and operating and still ensure that you're getting the job done? And that turned out to be more difficult for people than they thought it was going to be, especially for managers who said, if I can't walk by somebody's desk, it's really hard for me to know what they're doing and whether we're, doing what we're supposed to be doing. A lot of the mechanisms to do that type of analysis aren't in place.
So where does McKinsey believe the federal government really needs to focus their attention in the near term?
Yeah, I think there's really sort of four categories of things. So the first one is remote and flexible work models. And I think that's really about, you actually need to, in a lot of cases, adjust policy and adjust the way that work is done from a managerial, organizational, cultural, and process perspective in order to operate in a remote construct. Mm-hmm. You need to be able to first of all have people be remote. You need to be able to support them and give them the right sets of tools and capabilities in order to be remote. And I don't mean in this case I don't mean technology tools, although that's also important. I mean, how do you manage your time? How does your workflow look now that you're in a remote environment and you can't just walk something over to somebody else's desk? What's the set of partnering methods that you should use with your team? How do you interact with other people? So there's a bunch of things on the workforce side. The second piece is the tech. And, I think there's some really tactical, simple investments that a lot of people have made around, making sure that people have GFE and phones and those kind of things and getting the collaboration software right. Do I need to do something with my instant messenger or with the way that I store documents? But there's also a lot of refactoring that organizations are having to do around their core infrastructure and their core networks to say, I need to be able to not just have a separate set of services that I access when I'm outside the office. Mm-hmm. I actually need to be able to have the potential to access the same capabilities remotely that I access on site. And that presents some unique security concerns for organizations, particularly who take security very seriously, like in the defense space. Who really have to be quite thoughtful around how do you transform the architecture in a way that's going to be secure, but also still allow for productivity. On that piece, one of the conversations that we've been hearing a lot in those spaces that has led to more risk tolerance there is often when you're having a cybersecurity conversation, you're having a conversation about what is the risk, and you can take a very stringent risk posture based on the risk that is presented. In this case, the risk that's presented is we don't deliver on our mission, and so being able to use that as an argument, I think, has created some flexibility. So that's right. Technology. That's that second theme. I think the third one is really automation, which is there's a whole bunch of stuff, and I mentioned the timesheet example earlier, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that gets done on site that doesn't necessarily need to be done on site, or that can be done, sort of in an automated fashion on site and then, made up the rest of it sort of remotely. We saw things in various agencies like document transfer and signatures being a big one, or, the timesheet one, or, onboarding of employees and account creation. There were a lot of tasks that required being on site that are also automatable. And so the thinking is, if you can go automate those tasks, you not only sort of save the time and the speed and the resourcing, that you get all the great benefits of automation, but you also, create a more resilient workforce, and you reduce the need to be on site. And then I guess the final thing is organizations are really re-examining their facilities footprints. Many of our private sector clients are, taking a target of, 20, 30, 40% reduction in facilities with the assumption that people will continue to do remote work over time. And so, this can be both about sort of reduction in facilities footprint and the cost savings that comes from that. But even if you're not going to do that, and many federal agencies have not decided to do that, about refactoring that workspace so that it is going to work in the future environment, having more flexibility in the workspace, having more spaces for meetings and for joint use, joint use of space, as opposed to, sort of the cube farm view of the world. So those are kind of the big four.
Okay. Well, let's unpack each of those a little bit further, starting with remote work. Let me ask you, David, was the rapid transition to a work from home model, was it a much bigger challenge for the public sector as opposed to the private sector? Is that what you found?
I mean, certainly it was bad for everybody. So there's no getting around, the challenge that existed in the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
I think the infrastructure that the public sector started out with was in a more challenged state than the private sector was. Many private sector organizations are used to having at least partial work from home, so they've already got a lot of the infrastructure set up. Most private sector organizations issue laptops by default and desktops by exception. And of course, in the federal government, in many cases, that's reversed. So, there certainly was a head start in the private sector compared to the public sector, but it was difficult for everybody.
Is work from home here to stay, in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, we've seen that the majority of the workforce, I think 80% or more would like to work remotely at least one day a week afterwards. Mm-hmm. And, about half of government full-time and contract workers would like to work remotely full-time. Now, they won't necessarily achieve all of those metrics, but I think it's really important to note that the majority of people, I would say very few people want to be fully remote, or not everybody does, but most people want to be at least somewhat remote.
What if employers, including federal government or agencies, what if they say no to remote work?
Yeah, we've already seen some of this, right? With and employees will threaten to and then follow through on their threat to quit, right? I think about a third of employees have said that if they have to return to the office full time, they'll seek out a different job, and the work location is a major factor in job selection for many people. So you don't just have to worry about retaining the current generation of talent; you have to worry about being able to attract the next generation of talent. The federal government has enough talent challenges as it is, particularly when you talk about new types of talent, data scientists, software engineers, people who are doing sort of next generation tech things. There are tons of hurdles already. If you want to add to that hurdle, and by the way, only for you in the federal government, you now have to be on site all the time when everybody else gets to work from home 2-3 days a week. That'll just add to the challenge.
So what are some of the initiatives you see leading organizations undertaking to address the remote work topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a few things on that workforce side, right? It's being able to actually go and classify and get really tied on the definitions of what work can and can't be done remotely and how that work should be done remotely first and foremost. So, if you were to split your mission up into components, which things really require being on site with a team full time? Which ones require you to be able to, have an on-site connection, but maybe you can work from an office location closer to your house. You don't have to come all the way to the headquarters building if you have one. Which roles rather get to, partially telework and can do sort of a hybrid model, and then which ones can be full-time remote. All of those options, laying out all those options, mm-hmm. and having a really fact-based conversation about why a specific role or activity falls into one bucket and not another. Is it a true security concern, or is it simply the preference of an individual manager? So that's one piece, is that, sort of structural and definitional piece. The second one is, really updating and thinking about performance and review criteria, and so that they incentivize the right set of behaviors for people to be managing in a remote context in support of a remote work. Third is around, sort of connectivity and organizational culture. I think if you ask almost any organization, will say that their culture has decayed significantly since the beginning of COVID, because it's so much harder to maintain that interpersonal connectivity. And to be able to have sort of the soft things that make an organization the way it is, the conversations around the water cooler, or the in-person team events, or the impromptu, lunch meetings. Those things have really suffered, and you can try really hard to create a virtual mechanism for those, and we've seen some success on those across our clients, but it's really challenging to substitute. And then the fourth one is really the training piece, imbuing the workforce with the set of skills that they need to operate in this new environment, and helping them to know how to run their jobs and their day-to-day on and off work lives in the context of remote work, where I think we've often seen a lot of seepage and the feeling that the workday never ends now. So, what capabilities do I need and what do I need to enforce from a cultural perspective to make sure that that isn't the case?
Okay, let's move on to the second focus area, that of technology. So, David, radically updating the government's systems and data has been a persistent topic for as long as you and I have probably been alive. Do you think we're finally on the precipice of some changes in the infrastructure in the federal government under the new administration?
I think so. I'm reminded of a comic that I saw online that said, what drove digital transformation in your organization? And the choices were CEO, CIO, CTO, and of course, circled was COVID-19. I think Satya Nadella said from Microsoft said, they've seen more digital transformation in 2 months of COVID than they did in 2 years before that. So I think that trend is happening all over the place. I think that technology has also become a critical topic area, in the boardrooms or top teams, if you want to call it, in the public sector. Where cybersecurity is increasingly a topic that is getting attention and that people care about, and that between the sort of resilience argument of, well, remember when I couldn't do my mission because of the old architecture and what happened in COVID, and between that and the cybersecurity argument, I think we are hopefully going to see a generational investment in IT, and you see the administration, I think, reflecting some of those priorities, with the investment, for instance, that they want to make in expanding the size of the technology modernization fund that's available to agencies, and you see it in a lot of senior executive sort of priorities and resourcing requests.
What do you believe are some of the initiatives that they should take in this area of revamping the technology?
Yeah, I think it's a few things. There's the really tactical stuff around hardware and making sure that you're in the right position from that perspective. There, I think, is been a lot of work done on the collaboration tools over the course of COVID-19 and the ability for people to be able to share and do work. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. One of the main challenges that I think people have mastered things like, chat and, very simple document sharing stuff and those kind of things before. In the post-COVID environment, workflow management becomes super important. The ability to push a process along digitally as opposed to, in analog or via email, becomes really critical. And then I think there's a huge investment probably in cybersecurity, right? And in order to get people comfortable with the work from home piece, you certainly have a lot of investments there. Many of the tools that people are going to want to be using are cloud-based, and they should be. But the federal government is overall underinvested when it comes to cloud security, and just generally underdeveloped when it comes to cloud more broadly. So I think there's both cloud and cloud security investments coming, in addition to some probably other IT security investments as well.
Okay. So the next major focus area that you referenced is automation, which I know this is going to come as a huge shock, but I definitely support. From our perspective, the public sector in general has lagged behind the private sector quite a bit in terms of taking advantage of robotic process automation and artificial intelligence. However, the level of interest and investment among the federal entities has definitely increased in recent years. In fact, with COVID, we've been helping federal and state level agencies with automating things like Medicaid claim processing and paying unemployment benefits, since those things have really just seen incredible volume. So, David, what does McKinsey estimate the potential savings to be in the federal government if you just consider areas like finance, HR, and procurement?
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to characterize the savings in the right way. There's a couple of types of savings, and the most important, I think, is cycle time and speed, right? Because when you frame automation in terms of the ability to free up people to do other things. I think that's a really important benefit. And there's probably, call it, 30% of the, that's a 30%, opportunity in most of those areas you mentioned to, reduce people's manual work so that they can spend time on higher order cognitive tasks. But I think that even with all the messaging in the world, a lot of federal agencies have still expressed anxiety and still continue to struggle with the perception that they're, replacing a person with a robot, or that, somebody's going to lose their job as a result of this. I think, the messaging of that is super important to highlight that, actually there's more work than can be done to go around, and this will just allow you to focus on the parts of your work that are actually matter and are interesting, as opposed to copying and pasting something. But that messaging component, I think, is really important. But the other component is articulating the value, not just in terms of the time that you saved, but in terms of not just in terms of the touch time you save, but in terms of the cycle time, right? So we've, in some of these cases, seen 70, 80% faster processes. And that doesn't just mean, we've eliminated steps that take up that much time. It's actually re-architecting the business process at the same time as you're re-architecting the automation to take advantage of the automation. We'll always say if you automate a bad process, you will get some impact from it. But if you reinvent the process in the context of automation, that's where you get to that sort of 70 to 80% speed improvement.
Where do you think the federal government should focus their automation efforts in the near term?
I think it's a few things. One is, in the categories that you mentioned, right? Finance, HR, procurement. I think there's a lot of table stakes stuff that's being done there. That really, those professionals are often overburdened. If you think about like the contracting officer workforce in the U.S. government, or the HR professional workforce in the U.S. government, these folks are some of the most important people to making sure work actually gets done. But they often spend a lot of their time doing, tasks that we shouldn't be asking them to do, writing the contract terms into a contract that you've already written 17 times and trying to find an old one to paste in there. Manually screening resumes to make sure that somebody has graduated college if the position requires them to have graduated college, right? Things that are not a task that requires thinking. And I think, those people have tons of other stuff they could be doing, proactive sourcing of talent, really thinking through requirements with mission owners on the contract side. So I think the back office has a ton of value that can be created from automation. So that's one. Two is tactically in the context of COVID, can we automate the things that are requiring office visits? So those timesheets, those onboarding activities, the other things that require me to come into the office, so that I can reduce the burden to facilitating remote work. And then the third piece I mentioned, I think already, was the workflow automation piece that says, can I make sure that that nothing is dependent on somebody manually going and checking a queue and trying to figure out the status of something, but that I've just proactively, facilitated everybody's work a bit easier.
So the fourth and the final focus area for the federal government that McKinsey is recommending is reimagining the facilities and really rethinking what that needs to look like going forward. How much of a reduction in real estate cost would you expect to see across the federal government in the coming years?
Yeah, it's hard to say, right? It requires a lot of execution. I think that more likely what we will see than a wholesale reduction in real estate cost in the federal government is a reallocation of real estate resources in a couple of ways. One is a lot of federal agencies that have sort of a headquarters and field mentality, I think will end up spending a lot more resources on the field over time, and targeting those field investment areas in places that will allow them to do more and different work than they have done in the past, right? So expanding their outposts in high tech areas like Silicon Valley or Austin, expanding their support areas to places which tend to have talented labor that is lower cost, right? Those types of things where it's really hard to do that if everybody is required to be sitting in DC, Virginia, or Maryland. But if you were to expand to the full of the United States, you have both expanded access to talent, and a much more resilience. So I think we'll see a lot of shift in terms of the investment profile away from sort of the headquarters into the field. There probably will also be some savings, candidly, or at least some cost avoidance from, cancellation of major construction projects or avoiding building new buildings that we don't necessarily need. But it requires, I think, a lot of the change management to happen on the remote work front first. And then, of course, there's the investment in the collaboration spaces that we've seen before, and also, candidly, some organizations I've heard speaking about reallocating some of their facilities budget into the technology budget to facilitate the investment in those cloud security tools and the collaboration tools and the equipment that's required to work from home.
So, what are some steps that you're recommending to federal entities in this area, David?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. First of all, we talked before about having that sort of, workforce disposition or who gets to work from home or what roles are suited for remote work sort of conversation. When you do that, using that analysis to inform a plan for the future facility that says, okay, if what my estimate is that 30% of my workforce can work from home perpetually, another 20% can work from home on a hybrid basis, another 20% can work from any office location, and then 20% must be co-located. There's a bunch of analytics that you then have to do to say, and what does that imply about where people should be in the future, and which facilities should be larger or smaller, where we can where we might be able to take some risk, where we might be able to expand into field sites. So that's one piece, is really doing that analysis. Okay. The second is, thinking about better uses of the space, right? The sort of hoteling and flexible space. How do you create the adaptability to be able to change as things evolve, and to be able to reclaim that space as it exists. One of the reasons that we have gigantic federal office buildings and things that feel both crowded and empty at the same time is because we are, structurally set up to have an individual sitting in a space working, and to be unable to reclaim that space when that person's not present. In the context of remote work, that doesn't become, because they're gone for meetings for a couple of hours a day, that becomes, because they're gone for days a week. And so really investing in the infrastructure to be able to and the culture change to be able to say, this isn't my desk necessarily in 100% of cases, but this is a place where the organization can get to work. And then finally, I think, doing the technology infrastructure investment while you're doing the facilities investment. A lot of our defense clients, have to deal with the idea that they may have some conversations that are classified, and they may have some conversations that are unclassified, and where they need to be accessing, conferencing with people remotely, and that those may need to happen in the same office space. So, if you're going to do that, how do you invest in the facility now to make sure that can occur in the future?
Makes a lot of sense, David. Thank you for going through those 4 areas and breaking those down in more detail for us. What you've described definitely sounds like the right things for the federal government to focus on. It's also a lot of work, and it will require strong executive leadership to pull it off, no doubt. What are some of the best practices you would recommend to ensure it is done correctly?
Yeah, I think it's a few things. One is, setting a really clear and quantified aspiration. So after you've done the work to say which roles can or can't be remote and how should they be delivered in the future, saying, taking a stand and saying, this is what I aspire to achieve quantifiably, and then communicating that aspiration, broadly to the workforce to make sure that they understand and are bought in and see you taking action. That's part one. Part two is, this is a cross-functional initiative inherently, right? It touches HR, it touches facilities, it touches technology, it touches security, and then it touches each component of the workforce that may be remote. And so, you need some type of central axis that can orchestrate, that coordinated effort across all of those parties. And that central axis probably needs to have some type of senior sponsor, that is able to sort of galvanize the organization around this topic. The next thing is really feedback, right? Which is, different agencies or departments are going to work differently when it comes to this stuff. And getting the input of the workforce, of managers and of others, in a structured fashion that, is accretive to the future posture that you want to take, and not just sort of encouragement for people to complain. You have to strike the right balance there, but getting that input is really critical. And then, you've got to have some set of what you might call like portfolio and governance around it, which says, I've set aside a set of money to do these activities, and I'm gonna govern and measure the return on the investments that I'm making. How do I ensure that when I've invested in flexible workspace, that's paying dividends, or that when I'm buying technology for people, they're actually using it? And can I quantify and track the return on the investments that I'm making? And then I think the last thing is really sort of, change management and communications, which is easy to say and hard to do. But, you have to be able to roll this out in a way that people will believe you. You have to have the right set of, we always think about change, in sort of four areas, right? There's that you've made people understand why you're doing something and agree that it should be done, right? So articulating the mission case for this, not just the fact that people want to be remote. That you have created the right set of reinforcement mechanisms and processes to make this way of working, the best, most career accretive and easiest way to work. So that might be some of the performance review things. That might be, setting up the processes in the way that they just naturally work this way. It might be what metrics you track. The third is that you've built people's skills and given them the confidence, right? So we talked some about training earlier. And the fourth is role modeling, right? And I think this one is really especially critical in the federal context, because what often happens is we see, people trying to pivot to this remote work cycle at the middle and lower levels of the organization. But at the end of the day, the seniors come into the office every day, and there ends up being a sense of being left out. And, you weren't in the conversation, or you weren't in the meeting because everybody else was on site. And so if you actually want that to change, the senior leaders of the organization, the number one, the number two, the senior executive service positions, those people actually need to be remote, at least part of the time as well, if for nothing else than to role model that's a successful career path to be in the organization, and that you can achieve it.
Well, great stuff, David. Really want to just thank you for your time today. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts and insights related to reimagining work in the federal government. Such an important topic. So thanks again. So long for now, and be well.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel, where you'll find all of our previous episodes. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.